So I'm very pleased to welcome Lucy Passmore as our presenter today. Lucy is co-author of the Mindset for IELTS course. She began teaching English in 2002 in the UK and Spain, where she prepared young learners for Cambridge English exams. She's been a tutor of English for academic purposes since 2008 and has taught on IELTS preparation courses in addition to preparing international students to start degree courses at Brunel University and King's College London. Lucy is currently based at King's College London, where she teaches on foundation programmes for international students. She provides in-sessional support in academic writing for current students, and she contributes to materials and course design. So, over to you, Lucy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jessica. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on promoting self-study for success in IELTS. So my name's Lucy Passmore, and as Jessica says, I'm a co-author of the Mindset for IELTS series. I've worked on the foundation level students book, the level 3 teachers book, and I've also worked on a number of the additional online modules that come with these books. In today's webinar, example materials for the approach I'm going to demonstrate, which is a flipped IELTS writing classroom, will be taken from the level 3 students book and the accompanying online skills module for writing, which you can see here. Now, as you can see, this book is aimed at students with a target band of 7.5. But if your students aren't at that level, don't worry at all. This approach really can be used with any level, and indeed any IELTS coursebook series. So before we get into the main content of the webinar, I just wanted to briefly introduce you to the online modules that come with the Mindset series and which I worked on as a co-author. I'm going to be referring to these later on, so we'll just have a quick familiarisation. I think these are a really excellent resource for students and for teachers for facilitating effective self-study. They can be easily accessed by students using a unique code that they can find in the front cover of their student's book. The student has the option of joining an online class, which will need to be set up by the teacher, or they can select the self-study option, which is pretty much good to go. So once they've registered and logged in, students can access the online test bank with practice tests, language-specific modules, and online skills modules. And later in the webinar today, I'm going to be explaining how the online skills modules can be used to facilitate a flipped learning approach for a writing class. So let's have a quick look at an outline of what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to begin by considering why students may find self-study for IELTS difficult, and I'd actually like a little bit of your input at this stage as well. I'm going to be asking you to write about some of your experiences in the chat box. We're then going to think about additional materials. There's quite a lot of these available, and think about how we can help our students to really make the most of additional materials for self-study. I'll then be introducing an approach called the flipped classroom. Now, you may well have heard of this, and you may well even have tried it yourself. You may even use it regularly. But what I'm really going to focus on is to what extent this approach is useful for teaching exam classes, such as IELTS. And finally, I'm going to be talking you through a sort of step-by-step practical example of how we can use the Mindset for IELTS online skills modules for level 3 to flip an IELTS writing class. Right then, let's begin with our first discussion topic. So why might students find studying for IELTS difficult? Now, before I give you some ideas about this, I'm just going to open this up to you. So if you're currently teaching an IELTS class, I'd like you just to think about some difficulties that your students might have with self-study, whether this is doing it in the first place, what to do, how to get started and so on. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to type some contributions in the chat box, and then we'll use these to extend our conversation a little bit further. Okay, this is looking really good. I'm seeing some nice contributions here. So it's all about techniques. That's very relevant, and we're going to be talking about that a bit today. They don't know where to start. I'm seeing quite a bit. We, of course, have the issue of having the vocabulary and grammar to be able to understand the text and to write well, having limited time in the exam. Students focused on memorising vocabulary, that's interesting. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your contributions there. I think a lot of these are really relevant. Certainly, knowing how to get started is an issue that lots of students have. The level of vocabulary and grammar that they need can certainly be a challenge as well. Interesting, one thing I haven't seen, and I may just have missed this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't seen anyone say that their students are demotivated. And I think generally with IELTS students, lack of motivation tends not to be the problem. Most students are very highly motivated to achieve their desired band score, and they are generally willing to do extra self-study, which is one of the things I really like about having an IELTS class and IELTS students. So if most students are motivated towards self-study, what might stop them from being successful? Well, you've certainly given plenty of really relevant points here, but I'd like to focus on 4 key issues that students may have. The first of these, and I think this has certainly been raised in the chat, is feeling overwhelmed just by the sheer range of resources that are available and not really knowing where to start. So they have their coursebook, obviously, that they're using in the classroom. They have their additional materials that their teacher might give them from workbooks. There are plenty of official and unofficial websites with loads of good resources. So whilst this is obviously a positive, it's great that students have such a range of resources, they may be in need of guidance for how to best use them. And a second issue could be fixating on being able to achieve a particular score rather than developing exam skills and strategies. And I think this was a point that somebody raised quite early on in the chat. When it comes to studying for exams, I think students are understandably preoccupied by the score they need to achieve in order to realise their goals. So, for example, they may be hoping to study at a UK university, which means they're going to need to get a score of 6.5 or higher. But fixating on scores may hinder the development of the skills and strategies that students need to succeed in IELTS. A third difficulty that students might have, particularly our lower level students, is having difficulty identifying their individual weaknesses. They might generalise too much. So, for example, we've probably all had a student who has said, I'm really weak at writing. Writing is my weak point. But they might not have the awareness to be able to identify the specific writing subskills that they need to work on. So is it an issue with their cohesion? Is it grammar and vocabulary? And so on. So without this knowledge, they'll find it difficult to make progress. And they might choose self-study tasks that that are less likely to help them improve in these specific areas. So this is where they might need a bit more guidance. And finally, we've all probably had one of those students who's done every single practice test in the test bank in the hope that if they do enough tests, everything will magically click into place and they'll be able to improve their score. Unfortunately, as we know as tutors, IELTS doesn't work like this, and in order to be successful, students need to practice skills and strategies to help them improve their score. Of course, and I want to stress this, practice tests are really useful. They're a great study resource. They help students to become familiar with the format of the test, to practice the timings, and to become familiar with the task types and question types. So they're a really valuable resource for students to use as long as they use them wisely and that they are doing other types of self-study as well. So there we have 4 barriers to effective self-study, and you have mentioned many more as well in the chat. So thank you very much for all of those contributions. I'm sure you can picture 1 or 2 of your own students who fit some of these descriptions. So how are we going to help them to study more effectively and to make the most of the resources that they have available for them? So let's move on to making the most of additional materials. So as I mentioned previously, students have access to a wide range of materials. They've got the official IELTS preparation materials, which they can access online and through an app on their phone. You have official practice tests, the textbook that they're using in their classroom. As a teacher, you're probably giving students additional materials from workbooks and perhaps additional photocopyable materials available in the teacher's book. You have online skills modules like the one from Mindset for IELTS that I showed you earlier. And then you've got your unofficial websites offering advice, IELTS, Liz and so on, which can be really, really useful as well. So as I said before, whilst it's great to have all these materials, the choice can be a bit overwhelming for students, and it can hinder rather than help their ability to study effectively. Therefore, a really important job that we have as IELTS tutors is to help our students to navigate these resources and to use them in a way that's going to help them to develop the skills they need to succeed at IELTS. And one really important consideration is that students are able to clearly link what they're learning in the classroom to their self-study goals. And one way that we can create a really nice continuity between the learning that students do in the classroom and learning through self-study is to adopt the flipped learning approach. So before we talk about the flipped learning approach, this has been in the press quite a lot recently, and you've no doubt heard of it. I'd be quite interested to hear what your experience is with using flipped learning. Have you ever tried using it yourself? Do you use it regularly? Is it something that you'd like to try? So again, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to add some contributions to the chat box, and then we'll extend the conversation from there. So I'm going to pause for a minute and let you type in some of your experiences of the flipped classroom. Okay, so we have some people who have tried it. Somebody using Google Classroom, that's a really good resource for flipped learning. That's great to hear. We have a comment here. I'm often frustrated when students haven't done their part for the flipped classroom, i.e. their reading. That's a very relevant point, and I will come back to that a little bit later on. Okay, that's great. So I've noticed a number of people using this approach, a number of people who would like to use it, and a number of people who would like to learn a little bit more about it as well. So what I'm going to do now is give just a brief overview of how the flipped classroom works, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how we can apply it more specifically to IELTS. So in the flipped classroom, or the flipped learning approach, I'll use these interchangeably, students are given specific tasks to do to prepare for a class. So in other words, to be studied at home before they come to the class. This usually involves technology such as videos, screencasts, or online exercises for students to do. The idea behind this is it leaves more time in the class to focus on practical skills like peer collaboration and evaluation. So all of those things that we'd really like to do more of in the classroom, but we often find ourselves short of time, particularly if we think about the context of IELTS once we've pre-taught vocabulary, gone through the grammar, and so on. This approach has gained popularity across all education sectors. It's particularly prominent in higher education, and this is because there's been a lot of discussion recently around the values of lectures. So obviously lectures are a very efficient way of delivering information to a large number of students. But with the popularity and ease of remote learning these days, it's been questioned more and more whether this is a good use of students' time. So flipped learning can be really useful here if we get students to listen to the lecture before the class and then use the class time, the contact time with the teacher, for a lot more discussion, evaluation, use of critical thinking skills, and so on. Just to give you a definition, this is a really nice clear one from Hamden et al., who have published a white paper promoting the use of flipped learning in the higher education sector. They say, in this model, some lessons are delivered outside of the group learning space using video or other modes of delivery. Class time then is available for students to engage in hands-on learning, collaborate with their peers, and evaluate their progress, and for teachers to provide one-on-one assistance, guidance, and inspiration. So we can see from this definition that the flipped learning approach is a very it gives us a very student-centred classroom where students are really at the centre of the learning, and teachers are kind of on hand to guide them along. And obviously, when we're teaching English EFL classes in general, this is the type of approach that we're often going for. Just to give you a little more visual image of this is a nice infographic from the University of Texas. So we can see here the student preparing to participate in class activities before the class at home. Then during the class, we have a much more collaborative environment where students perhaps apply some key concepts that they've learned in the preparation activities and get feedback from their peers and their teacher. And then afterwards, we typically have a consolidation stage, which again takes place outside the classroom. This allows students to check their understanding of what they've learned in the class and to extend their learning. So that's quite a nice resource to use there. So what are the benefits of using the flipped learning approach? Well, one key benefit is that students are able to complete tasks at their own pace. This is very relevant to exam classes because it eliminates to a certain extent the issue of, for the teacher, of students who are finishing very quickly. And then we have students who are maybe a little bit slower and perhaps feel that they have to rush through so they can keep up with the rest of the class, which means they're not really getting the most out of the exercises. So this is obviously great for students in mixed level groups. There's a lot less pressure for them. It also allows the teacher to offer a more individualised self-study experience, more individualised options, because it is possible to give different tasks to different students. It means, as we saw in the definition and in the diagram, that the class can be used for more hands-on learning, collaborative tasks, an evaluation. And as you can imagine, this can be really useful in the IELTS classroom, where you might want to have time to discuss work students have done, to discuss a speaking task, to discuss a piece of writing that they've done, and so on. But often we just are too pushed for time in the class time. It also provides students with regular guided self-study. And I think the idea of being guided is really key here. We talked earlier about students having lots of different resources for IELTS, but just not really knowing where to start. And if we're giving them very specific self-study tasks to do at home, then students might feel a lot more supported in what they're doing, and they're probably going to have a much clearer rationale for doing this particular self-study task. Okay, so all sounds good, but what are the potential problems of implementing the flipped classroom approach? And again here, I'm going to briefly open up the floor. For those of you who have tried flipped learning, what are some of the problems you've experienced? I remember someone earlier mentioned that perhaps students don't always do their part. In other words, they don't do the preparation activities. Any other problems that students might have, or that the teacher might have with implementing this approach? I'll pause for a minute and give you a couple of minutes to type in your ideas. Okay, well, we've had some really interesting comments here, and quite a lot around the use of technology. So the students might not feel very confident with using the technology. Indeed, the teacher might not feel very confident. These are all important points. I'm hoping the example I'm going to present to you a little bit later on is quite nice and straightforward. So hopefully that will give an example of how easy it can be to do this. Certainly the point that it's a new approach and students and indeed teachers may have a little mistrust in it is also very relevant. Students might feel the teacher's not doing their job properly if they're not teaching everything in the classroom, because this is what they're used to. And of course, there's the concern that students won't do the work. One really interesting point that somebody raised is, what do you do if you want to try a flipped approach, but you don't have students in a regular class? You're doing a one-off or one-stop workshop. That is a really interesting point, and one I would like to come back to when we have our question time afterwards. So thank you very much for your contributions. So potential problems. The key problem is really going to be that lazy student who never does their homework. So as a tutor, you've gone to all this effort to set up a flipped IELTS class. What do you do if the students come to the class and they haven't done the preparation activities? Obviously, this is very frustrating for the teacher. It can be mitigated through the use of a recap task. So even if the student frustratingly hasn't done their part, it is possible to give them the opportunity to catch up. So by a recap task, I mean this is where the teacher asks perhaps some open questions about how students got on with the preparation activities. I think this is a really important thing to do anyway, so that the teacher can get an idea for how much the students have understood, what they've got out of the preparation tasks, and to identify any problems, any common problems that students might have had. And I'll be giving you an example of this sort of recap task that we can do a little bit later on. in a later stage of the webinar. So what I'd like to turn to now is how useful is the flipped learning approach for teaching IELTS? It's a fairly new approach, so how well does it translate into the IELTS classroom? Well, what we would really need to think about as IELTS teachers is what do we need to use, what do we want to use the class time for, ideally, and what exercises can we give students to prepare for this in advance. So just a few ideas here. So as Tomlinson and Aish have commented, one way that we can do this, that we can set up a flipped classroom very effectively, is to set the grammar and vocabulary tasks as pre-class preparation. And this will then allow more time for skills practice in the classroom. A few of you mentioned earlier that students may find the level of vocabulary quite challenging, particularly if they're quite low-level students. And this might take up quite a lot of the class time. So if we do that pre-teaching beforehand, and it's quite easy, it's relatively straightforward to get students to do some online vocabulary activities before the class, as long as we've got the right resources. That will then allow a lot more time for skills practice in the class. So this is one way that we could do it. Another way that we could flip the IELTS classroom is to use class time for peer evaluation of productive tasks. This involves setting a writing or a speaking task for students to do in preparation for the class. So they would have to do a piece of writing or perhaps a recorded piece of speaking beforehand. The class time would then be used to discuss and evaluate this piece of writing. Now, obviously, if we're a bit worried about whether students are going to do the tasks beforehand, you may have some reservations about setting a piece of writing for students to do outside the class and to bring into the class. You may not altogether trust them to do that. It might be motivating for them to do it if they know that they're going to get some feedback. Now, someone has mentioned here in the question and answers box that peer correction is not always welcome by students. What students really want is feedback from their tutor. And this is very true, and it's something to take into account. I think an important thing here is to assure the students that they are still going to get feedback from their teacher. The peer feedback is not replacing the feedback from the teacher, but it can be very valuable as well from the point of view of students, because not only are they getting extra feedback, but they're familiarising themselves with both the strong points and weak points of another student's piece of writing. But a little bit more on that later on. So what I'd like to do now is just to walk you through a practical example using the Mindset for IELTS online skills modules that I introduced to you later on. Earlier in the webinar. We're going to imagine that we want to teach an IELTS writing class, and the objective is to help students to write a better advantages and disadvantages essay for IELTS Task 2. So this is the content of the student's book that we would like to teach in the classroom. Now, because we're going to flip this class, we want students to do some preparation tasks before this lesson. So we're going to set them the Unit 2 writing tasks in the online skills modules before the class. Now, let's just go back and have a look at some of the online exercises that we find in the skills modules. You can see an example here of what students can see when they log on to the online modules. So we imagine that students have already registered, they've used their access code and they've created an account. So to access the online skills modules for Unit 2, we want them to click on the box you can see here, which says Mindset for IELTS Level 3 Online Skills Modules. This is an example of an online exercise that students can do. One thing I really like about these exercises is that they include these sort of IELTS tick boxes, which gives a really clear rationale for why they're doing the exercise. So here, the exercise is based on answer planning for an advantages and disadvantages essay, and it's giving them some advice on why it's good to do this. If you plan your answer properly before you start writing, then it could help you to improve your task achievement score. So this is hopefully quite motivating for students. It gives them a rationale for doing the tasks. These are quite nice brief tasks to work through as well. It's a very nice user-friendly platform, so students can monitor their progress as they're going through. I think that's quite important for students. They can see how far along they've got. They can sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. Teachers can also monitor students' progress if they set up a classroom. So that could be one advantage of doing that. I think it's rather like Google Classroom. And then we have the final writing task. So this is the last task in the series of 10 exercises. If we were using a more traditional approach, we'd probably be giving these as extra activities for the students to do after they've done that unit of the course book. But because we want to do this as a flipped lesson, we're going to try to get our students to do it before the class. And it's very easy to do. Students can type their essay into the box here and then upload it. So you don't have to worry about students bringing their essays in on bits of paper. They're all going to be in one place, which is really handy. So the first step then, the teacher's going to need to set up the writing tasks for Unit 2 in the online module before the next class. This involves 10 exercises, and they include the following skills practice. So we've got an exercise on answer planning, which we saw in the example. We have identifying main and supporting ideas, identifying topic sentences, using discourse markers, paraphrasing to increase score for lexical resource, and then we've got the task 2 practice essay that we saw in the screenshot earlier. So the teacher's going to need to set all of this up before the class. So we imagine it's now the day of the class, the day the teacher is going to do the writing class. So the teacher is going to begin with a recap exercise to check students' understanding of the tasks they've completed and to identify common problems. So they could just give a very simple open question for students to discuss in pairs or small groups. So what did the writing skills module teach you about how to write a good advantages and disadvantages essay for IELTS writing task 2? Now, as we mentioned before, this is also an opportunity for those naughty students who haven't done the tasks to catch up and redeem themselves a bit. So they can ask their peers questions about it. How willing their classmates who have actually done the tasks will be to share this with them is, of course, up to them. But it's a chance for them to catch up a bit, and it will make it easier for them to get involved in the later activities. So that will be step 2. For step 3, so obviously while the students are having this discussion, the teacher's going to be listening in and monitoring, trying to identify any issues that students had, maybe things that they found surprisingly easy as well, things that they really understood. And once students have had a fair bit of time to do this, the teacher's going to pair up students and ask them to peer review their essays. So this is the essay that they wrote as part of the pre-class preparation, focusing on the skills that were covered in the online skills module. So students might be looking for things like clear topic sentences, a really well-planned answer, use of discourse markers, good coherence and cohesion, and so on. At this stage, any students who haven't done the essay, who haven't done this task before the class, could be paired up with another student, so they're kind of in a group of 3. So this student would then peer review another student's essay. Of course, they're not going to have the advantage of having somebody peer review their essay, but they're still taking part in the class. So this will hopefully motivate them to do their writing task in the future. So we want to give students a fair amount of time to do this, so they can really get into using those skills of evaluation, giving peer feedback, have a really good collaborative experience with the teacher listening in, monitoring, and just checking how students are getting on with that. For step 4, this is where the teacher is going to select further areas for the class to work on from the students' book, based on the monitoring they've been doing of the students' discussion. So they might decide that students are still having a bit of difficulty using discourse markers. So they might decide to set some more tasks from the students' book for students to do in the class there and then. They may decide that the students have really got on all right with everything, in which case they can set some further tasks from the book. Now, towards the end of Unit 2 of this writing lesson in the Level 3 students book, there are some tasks on writing introductions and conclusions. And this was something that wasn't covered in the pre-class preparation, but it's obviously very important, and it's building on what students have learned about writing task 2 essays. So students would do this in the class, perhaps working through individually and then checking their answers in pairs and then with the rest of the class. So the final step then, the teacher's going to set some homework. So the teacher's going to ask students to look at their task 2 essay, the one that they wrote before the class. And again, for students who haven't written this essay, this is now their chance to do it. So they kind of get a second chance. For those who have done it, they're going to make improvements based on the peer feedback and the content of the lesson. So they might make some improvements to their introduction, for example. They might make their topic sentences a bit clearer. And then the teacher is going to take these essays in for marking the next week. So this is where these students are going to get their tutor feedback. It's just coming a little bit later. The teacher could decide to motivate the students, to reward them a little bit for doing their work by giving them that coveted IELTS score that they really want to know, but only after they've made the changes. So there we have it. That's a sort of basic step-by-step guide for flipping an IELTS writing class. So what are the advantages of flipping this lesson as opposed to doing it in the traditional way where students come to class, go through the coursebook unit and then do perhaps some extra self-study using the online modules afterwards? And it's worth pointing out there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing this. We're not saying that the flipped approach is always going to be the best approach. It's just an alternative way of doing things. But some advantages of doing it this way. Well, one of them is that students will have already familiarised themselves with some of the key features of an advantages and disadvantages essay. So they're coming to the class armed with that knowledge rather than coming in as a sort of blank slate. They already know some of them. And this is going to leave a lot more time to discuss how they could be implemented in their writing. And indeed, if they've done the writing, to look at how they have implemented these features. Students will have already done the piece of writing, so it's, as I mentioned, leaving class time free for peer evaluation and feedback. It might also, from students' viewpoint, kind of feel like the sort of big task is out of the way as well. So they've kind of done the bulk of the work, and they can now really benefit from getting some good feedback. The teacher has time to assess how students have got on almost before they start teaching the class. And it means that they can then tailor their content a lot more to their class. It's a really nice way of offering differentiation in the classroom and giving more or less practice of specific skills accordingly. I gave the example earlier of some students maybe needing to do more work on discourse markers, but it might be that different students need to do more work on different things, and the teacher is free to provide different groups with different additional tasks to do if they think that would be useful. So, important to point out, this is just one example of how the flipped classroom approach could be used in the IELTS. Obviously, we've looked at the Mindset for IELTS series, and the additional online materials that come with those, I think, are really good as using as pre-class preparation materials. But preparation tasks for any skills class could be set. You could use, for example, the online module for reading and get them to do work on reading strategies before coming in and doing a practice reading. And you don't have to be using the Mindset series either. I think it's a really good series to use. And particularly the online skills modules are great for a flipped learning approach, but you could use this approach with whatever IELTS resources you have available. Okay, lovely. Well, that brings us to the end of the talk, and thank you very much both for listening and for your contributions. It's been really interesting to read your comments as we've gone along. Here are some references that I used if you're interested in looking at those in a little bit more detail. And I think now we're just about ready to have some questions.
Yes, thanks, Lucy. That was a really informative session, and it was great to read all the comments going through in the chat box. It looks like there's a whole discussion going on there that possibly will be taken further on WhatsApp. That's fantastic. So just I've pulled out a few of the themes that we've seen through this session, and there's a lot of discussion around peer feedback. You know, students don't always welcome peer correction. They don't necessarily see the value of it, particularly in Asian cultures. We had quite a few people commenting from Japan that students are very reluctant to critique or be negative in any way. Others have said, well, we need to provide guidelines or a criteria that help students deliver that peer feedback. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a very relevant issue, and it's not. And I think it's really interesting. It's not necessarily that they don't value peer feedback. It could be that they just don't want to be too critical, or they don't feel that they can be critical of another student's work because maybe they don't feel experienced enough to do so, and they might feel that it's really the teacher's job to do that. I think we definitely do need to give our students some guidance, some sort of good practice guidelines on peer feedback. I think if we stress to them from the beginning that you're not criticising a student's work, you're not telling them that it's not good, you're giving them information that's going to help them to improve their writing, and obviously you're going to get the same in return. So it's very much a two-way thing. So a discussion around giving very constructive feedback as opposed to being critical. Because of course, if a student receives feedback that was quite critical, it might upset them and it might knock their confidence. In terms of guidance, we can give students a little bit more guideline, a more sort of step-by-step guide for giving peer feedback. In my example, I kind of imagined that we were just leaving the students to give their own peer feedback based on what they'd learnt in the preparation task, but that might not be realistic for all students. So what you could do is sort of put together a bit of a feedback checklist. So has this student included any clear topic sentences? Have they used discourse markers? Is there evidence of good answer planning? And have the students work through that. That way it feels kind of a little bit more impersonal as well, which might sit a bit more comfortably with students. And it's making a very clear link with what they've learnt in the pre-class preparation. And it won't sound quite as critical, I think. Even with that, students might still take a bit of convincing that it's a good idea to do. But I think it's really good for improving their critical thinking skills, which they're going to need if they want to, because obviously a lot of students want to study a university course. And it's just a really useful additional source of feedback. And if we can make it a little bit easier for students to do that, I think that will definitely help.
you. Lawrence has just come in with a question. We've focused today on writing. Have you any ideas for doing this flipped approach in the other skills, reading, listening, and speaking?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, for productive skills, a speaking lesson could be set up in a very similar way. Rather than getting students to do a piece of writing, you could get them to record a speaking task, perhaps a part two speaking. For IELTS Part 2, and then work on that in a similar way. If you were doing reading, for example, you might set them some tasks on reading strategies, which they'd work through before the class, and students can find these on the online skills module. So they might do the tasks on strategies before the class. They'd come in and you'd have this recap exercise where students talk about the strategies they've learned about, and then you might get them to try applying them by giving them a practice reading task to do in the class. Or you could even give them a practice reading task to do outside the class and then come in and talk about how they got on with it, and then have a really detailed explanation of how they use strategies to get a particular answer. So I think it can certainly be used with other skills besides writing.
Lucy. Something else, a common theme that came through your session, and I think some of the discussion in the chat box, is around this flipped approach requiring technology, and could it possibly disadvantage those students without access to the internet or devices?
This is also a very relevant point. Obviously, the example I showed you involved using technology, and a lot of flipped learning is based around using technology and remote learning. I think this really comes from the idea of listening to a lecture online, because flipped learning has sort of originated in higher education. And obviously for that, you need quite a bit of technology. I think for an IELTS class, it is possible to implement a flipped approach without using technology. So rather than giving students online exercises to complete, you could select some exercises from a workbook or some additional materials, or even some of the exercises from the course book you're using. So you might, for example, give students the vocabulary tasks from the course book to do before the class, which is going to free up some time in the classroom. So I think it's certainly possible to adopt a flipped approach without the use of technology, particularly for an IELTS class. Again, it's another advantage of having all of these different materials in all different formats. They can be used in this way as well.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think the million-dollar question around how can we encourage students to do the homework? How can we make sure that most of the class are coming in to the lesson having done the reading or the activity at home? Any ideas for that motivation?
Absolutely, and I think we do have to say that if you want to adopt a flipped approach, it may take a bit of time to get off the ground, particularly in terms of students not doing the tasks. So you might find you have a few sort of slightly frustrating lessons where not everyone has done it. I mean, I think giving students a really clear rationale for doing the tasks, if we can sort of convince them that they really want to be doing as much self-study as possible anyway to prepare for their IELTS exam, because they're not going to be able to learn absolutely everything they need to learn and practice all these strategies in the classroom alone. So we want to really stress to them they should be doing self-study anyway, and perhaps stress to them this is a really easy way of doing self-study, because I'm telling you exactly what you should do. I'm sorry, I hesitate to use telling you, it sounds a bit too teacher directed, but I'm giving you very good advice on what to study. It's going to be very relevant to the lesson. It's going to help you to get the most out of the lesson. So it might improve your understanding of what's going to be covered. So certainly making them aware of the advantages of doing self-study. Again, they might take a bit of convincing in terms of doing a piece of writing before the class. So you might need to convince them that it's a good idea to do it before. Why not do it in the class or outside the class? Again, giving them a very clear rationale. You could say, well, you'll have got the hard part out of the way, you'll have done the piece of writing, and it will give us time in the classroom to really have a look at your writing in detail. Your writing and other students' writing who you could learn a lot from. And this class time can be used for giving you feedback that you might not otherwise get because there might not otherwise be time. We would hope that these would encourage students to do the work outside the class. In reality, it may well take a bit of time and a few flipped lessons for things to click into place. Hopefully, there's going to be a critical mass of students who will be doing the tasks. And once the students who don't do the tasks see that they're getting a lot more out of the lesson, they're coming in a lot more knowledgeable, knowing a lot more about, say, the features of an essay and being able to really apply that in their writing, hopefully they will follow those students' lead and start and realise that it's a good idea to do the tasks beforehand. As much as it's frustrating, it is still possible to include these students in the lesson. They just won't be getting quite as much out of it. So I hope that answers that question, but I fully accept that it is a potential pitfall of using a flipped classroom approach. Jessica, would it be possible? I promised to talk about what we do if we have a one-off class, a one-stop IELTS class rather than a series of classes. Would it be okay if I just said a few words about that?
Absolutely, yes. We had a question come through how we can incorporate this approach in a one-stop workshop.
Okay, now this is obviously going to be a little bit more difficult to apply a flipped approach to a one-stop workshop. It's not impossible. This, I would say, might be a situation where you might decide that the traditional non-flipped classroom is just going to work a bit better. However, it's not impossible to use a flipped approach. What we would need to do is we'd need to sort of make contact with the students who are going to come to the class beforehand. And I realise this might be difficult to do because students might sign up at the last minute. But if we have a way of making contact with them via email, via a group email, or if we have a sort of online list of people who are going to come to the class and we have their contact detail. And if we have a way of contacting them and giving a brief rationale for doing some preparation. So we just say something like, I'd like you to do some preparation for this class. It won't take you very long. It means we can really make good use of the class time by doing a lot more feedback on writing you've done, for example, or focusing a lot more on strategies. Or if you were using the approach where you're going to pre-teach vocabulary, if you have a look at this vocabulary beforehand, it's going to really help you to take part in the class. We're actually not going to spend very much time on vocabulary in the class, so it will help you if you look at it beforehand. So it is possible to do as long as we have a way of making contact with the students and letting them know what they need to do beforehand. Of course, they may not have an IELTS course book that they're using, so you might need to, say, email them a couple of exercises. I would say in this case, keep it really simple. It might be best to just have a few vocabulary exercises that they're going to look at. It's a shame in a way because it would be really useful to get students to do a piece of writing beforehand if this is the only class they're going to have, because it would give them really useful feedback on that. But admittedly, it's possible, but a little bit more risky. Admittedly, I think this approach really does work better if you've got a class who are coming regularly and it's quite a long series of classes, but not impossible. And if the conversation is continuing after the webinar, it would be interesting to know if anyone has actually tried doing this.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. And we've had two that have come through. Hazel has said, is flipped learning more appropriate for mature and advanced learners? And then we had another question earlier on from someone that was saying, as a parent, how can they encourage their child to do self-study?
Okay, very interesting. Both. So is it more, I'll start with the first one, is it more appropriate for mature and advanced learners? I'll take those two a little bit separately to start off with. I'd say a more mature learner is perhaps going to be not wanting to make generalizations at all, but a mature learner might be a little bit more motivated. They might be sort of more prepared to do the self-study. They might be in a better position to understand the rationale behind learning in a different way. So in that sense, I guess more mature learners are going to be our ideal candidates for flipped learning. So I'd say it's easier, but not necessarily more appropriate. On the flip side, no pun intended, if you are using technology, it might be that younger learners are sort of a bit more comfortable with using technology. They might prefer doing sort of online exercises as opposed to sitting with, although of course we can do a flipped approach using books rather than online materials, but they might be perhaps a bit more savvy with the tech side of things. But again, not necessarily. I don't want to generalize here at all. Is it better for advanced learners? Well, again, having a higher level of language is going to help them to really understand the rationale behind doing it in this way. I would say if you have maybe less advanced, lower level learners, something like pre-teaching vocabulary is going to really help them, because that's something that could potentially take up a lot of time in the classroom and then not leave enough time for this valuable skills practice. So I would say, in a nutshell, that it's appropriate for any kind of learner, but the way in which you do it might be slightly different. I hope that's, that answers that question. And how about the question about a parent motivating their child to do self-study? That's a really interesting question. If it is a child studying for IELTS, I would imagine the parent is going to be quite invested. They may be responsible for the financial aspect of their child doing IELTS, and obviously they would like them to succeed and to get the score they need to go on to do whatever it is they'd like to do, whether that's preparing to study at university, a foundation course, and so on. I think if we're just talking about self-study as opposed to using this flipped approach, I think just being very supportive, trying our best not to make your child feel sort of under pressure. I think for parents, having a really good understanding of what their child is doing. So if they are studying for IELTS, I think if a parent can sort of get a really good idea about what's involved in the IELTS exam, and it might be that they've done it themselves in the past, but having a look at at the materials their child is using, perhaps having a look at some of the online resources, and I think if they understand, also understanding how difficult IELTS is, that will help them to sort of empathise and offer support. I must admit that's it's not a question I've ever been asked before. It's a very good question, but I think that would be a very good starting point for, as a parent, supporting a child doing IELTS.
Thank you, Lucy. Some really interesting discussion there. And thanks everyone for joining us. We're out of time now. That was a really, really fantastic session. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to download your certificate from the link on screen. If you click on promoting self-study, then the download box should then be able to, you should be able to click on it. You can edit your name on the file, save it and print it. If you're on a smartphone or a tablet, you might not be able to do this, so you can email us at cambridgeexams@cambridge.org. There should be the email link in the chat box. Thank you again to Lucy for such an informative session, and please join us again on Thursday the 21st of February for the next in our series of IELTS webinars. You should be able to find the link in the chat box. And thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone's contributions as well.
Bye. Bye, Lucy. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Jessica.